Good morning, children. This is A. Manoj Kumar, working in Oxford High School, Uppugunduru. We have been discussing about Africa. In this session, I am going to explain about the people of Africa. Okay, if you see India, different cultures existed in India. That means in India, we are going to observe different people. That means what is our different people in the sense we have many states, we have many culture, different people using different languages. Like that, if you go Africa, then many regions are existed in Africa, so that automatically many languages they are using. Okay, if you see ancient time onwards, then they are practicing hunters. They are living as hunters and gatherers, isn't it or not? They hunted animals because total area in Africa covered by the forest area. Then human existence first survived, prevailed in Africa. First existed in Africa. Then they practiced hunter and gatherers life. Okay, now then they became tribes. Okay, then they lived as a tribes. These tribes have different languages. Okay, now such a way they practiced their life. Okay, now they continued their life. Then if you see Africa, especially in equatorial regions, then dense forests are existed. Then there people are hunting and so gathering the tubers, fruits, etc. etc. If you go deserted area like Sahara, Kalahara, there also people are hunting different kinds of small animals. Okay, na? Even though much animal, that means much wildlife not existed in Sahara, Kalahara desert area, they are hunting little reptiles. Then they are gathering some kind of lime dates, like that. They are gathering fruits. Okay, na? Such a way they are continuing their lives. See what I've written. People of Africa, people with the different languages, lifestyles, and live in different regions of Africa. Since ancient times, people have lived in small tribes, carrying out hunting, gathering, animal husbandry, and agriculture. If you go any country, any continent, people are practicing such a things: hunting, gathering, animal husbandry, and agriculture. These are all common things. Ancient periods onwards, people are then leading such a way their lives, practicing, continuing their lives like that. Okay, na? Then hunters have inhabited the equatorial regions and deserts. So just now I mentioned. Then pastoralists inhabited the high plateaus and savanna, grazing their animals on the extensive grasslands. Sir, who are pastoralists? Pastors means who are grazing their animals. Okay, na? So these people are going to savanna area. So they are especially savanna area covered by high grasslands. Then they are grazing their animals. Then agriculture is common in Africa, where agriculture is common. See margins of the forest area and middle of the Africa. Agriculture has long been carried out on river banks as well as on the margins of forest. If you see India, if you see river Krishna and river Godavari, which is flowing towards Andhra Pradesh, then river banks, especially beside of Krishna river and beside of Godavari river, then we have lot of agricultural lands are existed. Like that, if you go Africa, then many rivers are flowing. Then beside of that rivers, they are practicing agriculture. Then margins of the forest area, they are practicing agriculture. Okay, na? This is the lifestyle of then practicing in Africa. Then see Africa, Europe and Asia. Earlier, if you observe, European people then Asian people do not know much about Africa. European people know regarding the northern part of Africa, then Asian people know regarding the eastern part of Africa. They don't know interior parts of Africa. Okay, na? Then later part of the time, Europeans then they went to inside of the Africa. Then they captured so many areas and made them as their colonies. That one you know. See here, for a long time, people from other continents have largely ignored about Africa. Europeans were familiar only with the north coastal regions of Africa, while the Indian and Arab traders knew about the eastern coast. Okay, just now I mentioned you this point. Apart from these coastal regions of Africa, while the Indian and Arab traders had much knowledge about the interior parts of Africa, that means they don't know regarding interior parts of Africa. What is interior parts of Africa, sir? Middle parts of Africa. Only by the time European traders and Indian traders know coastal, especially which coastal area? They know the east coastal area of Africa. Okay, na? Then see, about 500 years ago, Europeans began their attempts to reach India by the sea route by going around Africa. Okay, na? By that time, they reached two islands. They stopped in two islands. Those are Madeira Island and Azores Islands. They took some time rest in those islands, but if they fear to go beyond these islands, that means if they wanted to go south of the Azores Island or then Madeira Island, they thought these sea which is existed south of these islands, boiling sea is existed. If we go, then we will die. Like that they feared. That's why they didn't go middle of Africa. Do you understand? In 1498, what happened, you know? A Portuguese explorer, sailor, Vasco da Gama, then reached India. How he reached India? Went around the southern tip of the Africa. Okay, that means he traveled around the southern tip of Africa. Then he reached India. Okay, na? So this is about the people of Africa, Europe and Asia. Do you understand? If you open your textbook, page number 60, then the African coast given. Okay, na? African coast paragraph given. I will read out, then just to follow it. Page number 60, African coast. Tell me, we have coastal line or not? We have long coastal line. India has a long coastal line. Like India, African continent also having long coastal line. That means in African continent, many countries having many coastal lines. Okay, na? That means so adjacent to these countries, sea, that means Atlantic Ocean is flowing in some countries, then Indian Ocean touches some countries. You know that one. So already we discussed about Europe. By that time, then we discussed about base, isn't it or not? Okay. So see what he given. Initially, when Europeans tried to inland, many African tribes tried to go inland area. I told you just now, inland area means middle of the Africa. Then Europeans first tried to reach middle of Africa. Why, sir? Because they wanted to grab as much as, that means grab means captured most of the areas existed in Africa. They wanted to collect raw materials from them. They wanted to control the African tribes so that they tried to reach so interior parts of Africa. That one given. Europeans indulged in unfair trade. That means they practiced which kind of trade? Unfair trade. Okay, na? So false trade. Unfair trade means false trade. Try to enslave the African people. Enslave the African people means, slaves means you know very well. Okay, na? Suppose if I am enjoying my life with my own decisions, that is free life, democratic life. Somebody then controlling me, that is not free life, that is slave life. Such a way, these Europeans tried to slave Africans. Okay, na? Then they continued slave business afterwards. That one also I will explain you. Then they wanted to establish their rule over Africa and exploit the resources. This is the main aim of Africans. First they reached Asia. Why they reached Asia? They collected raw materials from Asia. Then these raw materials they exported to Europe. They made final goods in Europe. They sold these goods in Asia and Africa. Wherever they reached, okay, na, their main ultimate goal is to exploit the resources of that continent. That is the primary aim of Europeans. That's why they tried to go interior parts of Africa and enslave the Africans, and they practiced which kind of trade? Unfair trade they practiced. That one given in this paragraph. Then slave trade. You tell me, what is slave trade? You tell me. Slave means, just now I given one hint. In the 16th century, what happened, 15th century, by that time, 1492. Anybody, what happened? Tell me. Yes, Columbus, he wanted to reach India. Then he traveled westwards. Then he reached some islands, which is very near to the America. Those islands are called as West Indies. He thought that I reached India. Actually, these islands are not Indian islands. So these are all new innovation. That means newly found islands. Afterwards, some traders found that this is a new continent. This is not Indian continent. Then that is American continent. Like that, okay, not they disclosed. So that afterwards, many Europeans, they went to North America. That means American continent, and they settled down in America. By that time, people occupied much of the land in America, but labor is very less. Okay, na? They need labor by that time. What they done? Their eyes see towards the Africa. That means if they enslave the Africans, then they will do the labor in those fields. Then they will earn money. That is the primary aim of the Europeans. Okay, na? So by that purpose, they practiced then slave business in the 16th century. They practiced slave business in the 16th century. 16th century in the sense, the era between 1500 to 1599, that era is called as 16th century. Slave business they practiced which century? Yes, 16th century they practiced slave business. Once again, I will read out, listen carefully. In the 16th century, many Europeans began migrating to America and started cultivation there. Just now I told you. Okay, na? Whenever Europeans they found new continent, that is America, many people migrated to America and occupied much of the land in America and practiced agriculture. There was plenty of land in America, but not enough people to work on the fields. If you wanted to cultivate, if you decided to cultivate thousands of acres of land, by that time you need much labor. That much labor not available in America. They badly need much labor. That's why they wanted to purchase slaves from the Africans. Remember that one. To fill this gap, the slave trade from Africa began. They wanted to fill this gap. That means they want labor. Who want labor? Europeans who settled in America, they want labor. Africans were captured and enslaved mainly from the coastal areas of Guinea and as well as Eastern Africa. Okay, now especially tribal heads are there by that time. These tribal heads, that means these Europeans made contract with tribal heads. Okay, na? Then these tribal heads supplied people, African people to them. Okay, now this is a slave business. So in return, what they given? They given guns and different things they given to tribal heads. Okay, now see where they gathered these African slave people, especially Guinea and coastal regions. They gathered these people. Okay, now these coastal tribal heads provided the slave people to them. Okay, na? Then the captured people were brought to the coast and sold to the Europeans. In exchange for these slaves, the European tribal leaders accepted guns, iron objects, liquor, and clothes. They supplied tribal people, that means slaves, to Europeans. In return, Europeans, what they given? They given guns, iron objects, liquor, and other objects they given. That means clothes, etc., gems, etc., etc. The slaves were greatly oppressed. Okay, na? They don't wanted to go America as slaves. They wanted to stay in their homes only. But forcefully, okay, these travel heads sent to them. Okay, many of them died by the time they reached the ports. In between ports and their native places, somebody died due to the homesick, whatever meant due to the diseases attacked to them, they died. The ships were stuffed with slaves. Stuffed means then, especially for if a ship is going to one place, 50 members or 100 members generally they travel. That is the strength, the capacity of the ship. More than that, if you include the members, then automatically it is stuffed with more members. So instead of 100 members, 500 members stuffed to that ship. Okay, na? They don't have proper food facility by that time. Then they don't have proper medical facilities. Not that means proper medical facilities not provided by these Europeans in the traveling time. Okay, now I am talking about the travel time. By that time, somebody died. Okay, na? Then stuffed with slaves. There were no proper arrangements for food or medicine. In those days, it took several days to reach America. From Africa to America, so distance is more. In between, nearly it takes 20 to 25 days to reach America. Okay, they don't have food, medical facilities. Somebody died due to that reason. Do you understand? I think so. Even in America, inhuman treatment was meted out to them. Suppose somebody reached America finally, but they are not treated as a humans. Inhuman conditions prevailed. That means these people tortured by the Europeans, owners. Okay, na? Even in America, inhuman treatment was meted out to them. Then, despite working hard, they were not given proper food or living quarters. Okay, not given food, not provided quarters. Then, in this manner, millions of Africans were enslaved and taken to North and South America and then nearby islands. Lakhs of people died after they were made slaves. In the 16th and 17th century, numerous companies were engaged in the slave trade. In the 16th and 17th century, so many companies, especially they done which kind of business? Slave business they done. That means they captured the slave people and sold to North America and South America. Okay, na? So numerous companies were engaged in the slave trade. Eventually, the slave trade ended in the 19th century. Which century slave trade ended? 19th century slave trade ended. Okay, na? Then 19th century, and the slaves were declared free citizens in America in the 1860. So America declared these slaves as citizens of America in the year of 1860. That one remember. So these points are very, very important. What we discussed regarding the slave business. Slave business started in the 16th century in America. Why slave business started? Because especially Europeans found one new continent, that is nothing but American continent. Many Europeans, they migrated to America. They captured lakhs of acres of land. They don't have proper labor. Okay, na? They wanted to fill this gap, so that then they viewed the Africa. Then especially from Guinea and western part of Africa, okay, these slave people, okay, sent it to America. These tribal heads, okay, supplied these slave people to Americans. That means the Europeans. Okay, in return, what they got? They got guns, iron objects, then clothes. Okay, remaining things also they got it. The 16th, especially 16th and 17th century, the slave business continued a lot. Okay, now 19th century slave business ended. 1860 they got, okay, now rights in America. Who? Slaves. Okay, na? Such all those things we discussed in this particular session. Understood, I think so. These topics are very, very important. So textbook is reading is must and should you do. Okay, na? What I explained you, once again you go through the textbook, try to analyze it. Thank you.